Hi, I'm Ed Bacon, the rector of All Saints Church, Pasadena. Whoever you are and wherever you find yourself on the journey of faith, I hope that you'll find something here that speaks to you. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for being here. You are here on a very important and historic day. Let me get my reading glasses. For I'm thrilled that on this Sunday, after the release of this rather stunning and earth-shattering report, that we have one of the authors with us to tell us about it. We're very glad that ABC News is here. David, I forgot to ask you if you could just say one word when you get up here related to the gun control vote. Just before you get in. David, we ask David to come and speak every time he's in town. We share him when he's here to speak at Fuller. He is, I want to get this correct, he is the Distinguished University Professor of Christian Ethics and Director of the Center for Theology and Public Life at Mercer University, which happens to be my alma mater and also the place where I worked before I became an Episcopal priest. And so I love not only having that connection with David, but also I love being a student of his. And I want to just lift up 2 or 3 volumes that we have for sale so that you can continue your being a student of David's as well. David Gushee is mentored for many, many years by our friend Glenn Stassen at Fuller, who's here this morning. And they co-authored a very important text on Jesus and Jesus' understanding of life called Kingdom Ethics, Following Jesus in Contemporary Context, a very important volume to own. And then David, this past year, came out with his book, The Sacredness of Human Life. This is, I think, the 15th book of David Gushee, Why Ancient Biblical Vision is Key to the World's Future. And we're happy that Jeannie, his wife, is with us. Welcome, Jeannie. Thank you for being here. And Jeannie and David have a prayer book that they have written. Yours is the day, Lord, yours is the night, a morning and evening prayer book. So we have all 3 of these for sale. I could say so much more about David, but it would border on hagiography and worship, which would be so unseemly. So let's replace all of that kind of lugubriousness with my asking you to warmly welcome David Gushee.
It is so good to be at All Saints again and to have a chance to speak to this significant forum. It is an honor. Before you get too comfortable, Ed, Jeannie and I brought an autographed copy of our new prayer book for you, and so we would like to present it to you this morning.
Thank you very much.
I'm torn between sharing my prepared remarks and speaking a little more extemporaneously. Maybe I'll try some of both. But first, on the gun control vote, I think I would just say this, that that stricter background checks was just the first step needed in a dramatic cultural and policy change in our country related to our gun pathology. And we couldn't even pass that, or they couldn't even pass that last week. For the people who study this issue most closely, for the families most grievously wounded by senseless gun massacres, it was probably the most disappointing congressional vote in memory. It struck people like a blow to the heart. And part of what I do as an ethicist is to say that policy matters, and the church as an activist community on policy also matters. And we need to redouble our efforts to be sure that we get sensible gun control, gun safety in our country. And this was the first vote in 20 years, and there need to be more. And those who would block something as simple as stricter background checks need to know that they do not stand with the American people or with the Christian community. Amen. The occasion for our gathering this morning and for this invitation is this 577-page report called The Report of the Constitution Project's Task Force on Detainee Treatment. And let me just give you some background on this. It's so big, I hesitated to carry it out here, but I wanted you to actually see it. It is downloadable at detaineetaskforce.org. They're not selling them, they're giving them away. detaineetaskforce.org. The Constitution Project is a very valuable non-governmental organization in Washington whose mission is to provide oversight related to the strength of the rule of law in the United States. They are the Constitution Project. They seek to protect the Constitution in our country. Secular, non-governmental, civil society organization. In 2010, after President Obama said quite publicly that he would not undertake an investigation of detainee policies, the leaders of the Constitution Project decided to seek funding to do an investigation, and at as high a level as possible. The paradigm we operated from the beginning was the 9/11 Commission. After 9/11, you had a book-length report with a full-time staff doing investigations so that you would have an authoritative volume to tell the story of what went wrong and what happened that day and what do we learn from it. And that was really the paradigm that was followed for the Detainee Task Force report. The people who agreed to serve on the panel were a bipartisan group of mainly wise government. They're all wise, but mainly former government officials, many of whose names you might recognize. The co-chairs were Asa Hutchinson, who was a congressman Republican from Arkansas, who is now running for governor of Arkansas as a Republican, and I applaud his courage in participating in our panel. James Jones was the other co-chair. He was a congressman, Democrat from Oklahoma, and then U.S. ambassador to Mexico. Other names, Richard Epstein, conservative law professor from NYU and the Hoover Institution. David Irvine, former Republican state legislator, retired Army Brigadier General. Claudia Kennedy, first woman to achieve the rank of 3-star general in the United States Army. Thomas Pickering, a very famous ambassador who had served in a number of places, including UN ambassador. Former FBI Director William Sessions, Judge Sessions from Texas. And among others, Gerald Thompson, emeritus medicine professor at Columbia. He paid close attention to the issue of the role of medical professionals. And so we met for 2.5 years, and we studied every aspect of U.S. detainee policy since the first attack on U.S. soil during the Clinton administration. So the report covers the eras of Clinton, Bush, and Obama, and examines, among other things, I'll read from the cover, what happens at Guantanamo, Afghanistan, Iraq, what was happening inside the legal process of the federal government when administration officials were trying to figure out what the policies should be, rendition to other countries, in many cases where people were tortured, the development of CIA black sites, in which there were people that were snatched and disappeared to black sites in countries around the world. The role of medical professionals in detention and interrogation, the efficacy of torture, the effects and consequences of U.S. policies, even the issue of force feeding at Guantanamo, which is an issue right now that we talked about, the role of Congress, and the role of the Obama administration since 2009. as a Christian, it was a sincere honor to be added to this panel. I was the only one who was there specifically because of being an ethicist, a Christian ethicist. And, you know, this has been kind of my experience on this issue since I discovered it, or it discovered me in 2005. This is an issue in which a moral voice is needed. And it's an issue in which I have been among those who've had the opportunity to offer that moral voice. And that was the role that, you know, that I played on this panel. A kind of you would have been interested in how I navigated my role as a clergyman, you might say, and as an ethicist. It was not a lot of Bible quoting. It was more helping the government-type professionals on that panel think about the moral dimension of this issue through and through, and keep that in front of us. See, part of what has gone wrong in our country is we do not have a very strong capacity anymore for a moral conversation. Partly because we can't agree on anything about morality. And so, I mean, the most sophisticated we ever seem to get for a moral conversation is, did torture work? Oh, if it did, then it's right. If it didn't, then it's wrong. That's pure utilitarian thinking, and it's not good enough. According to U.S. law, it never matters whether torture works because torture is illegal. It is fundamentally banned without exception under our own laws. And the federal government officials knew that, and so the path that was taken was to define what was being done as not torture. Right? So you redefine your actions, and then it's okay. But under treaty obligation and under the law, we are not ever allowed to torture anybody. And the number one finding of our panel was that we did. But now, let me, in the interest of time, I think I'm going to summarize the main things that we discovered. And I'm just going to read from my notes here. And if you want, I can give you background in terms of my own involvement on this issue since 2004. The Detainee Task Force of the Constitution Project found that after 9/11, U.S. government officials were guided by a mandate from the President of the United States to do whatever was necessary to prevent another attack. Those officials whose decisions and actions later contributed to charges of abuse undertook those measures as their best efforts to protect their fellow citizens. But their intentions did not relieve them of their obligations to comply with existing treaties and laws. The need to respect legal and moral codes designed to maintain minimum standards of human rights is especially great in times of crisis and especially fragile. Being able to hold on to one's moral principles in times of crisis is a key mark of moral maturity, both for persons and for institutions. It's precisely when we are in emergency situations that we most need our ethics and our laws. But what happened after 9/11 is that we lost our grip on those ethics and those laws, and somewhat before that as well. The most important finding of our panel is that it is indisputable, bipartisanly agreed by everybody I just mentioned and others, everybody who was on the panel, it is indisputable that the United States engaged in the practice of torture. Indisputable. This conclusion is grounded in a thorough and detailed examination of what constitutes torture in many contexts, both historical and legal. The task force examined court cases in which torture was deemed to have occurred, both inside and outside this country, and in instances in which the United States government has leveled the charge of torture against other governments. The appendix, the first appendix of this report, actually does that work. It may be the most important thing about the report. Was it torture? By doing that systematic work, our own statutes, our State Department human rights reports, and our treaties, and international as well. We found that United States-sponsored torture occurred in many instances and across a wide range of theaters of war. This judgment is not restricted to the 3 famous cases in which detainees of the CIA were subjected to waterboarding, which had been approved at the highest levels. The panel concluded without dissent that arguments that our nation did not engage in torture and that much of what occurred should be defined as something less than torture were simply not credible. What was interesting, I can say, in being on the panel is this was no foregone conclusion. Most of the men and women who came into that room had not studied the issue closely, and especially those that were Republicans, that would not have been their natural inclination to want to start there, given the context politically. In fact, Asa Hutchinson said when he was interviewed by the New York Times, he said, "It took some convincing for me to be able to get there, but I was convinced." And so that should be taken seriously. This is not a left-wing hatchet job. This was a bipartisan report by people who had something to lose, you might say, especially people like Asa Hutchinson. The second notable conclusion of the task force is that the nation's highest officials bear some responsibility for the spread of torture. The most important element of that responsibility may have been the decision to declare that the Geneva Conventions did not apply to al-Qaeda and Taliban captives in Afghanistan or Guantanamo. The Bush administration, never specified what rules would apply instead, leaving a vacuum that became disastrous. The other major factor was President Bush's authorization of brutal techniques by the CIA for selected high-value detainees. The CIA also created its own detention and interrogation facilities at several locations in Afghanistan, and even more secretive black sites and we discovered more of these than I had ever heard of before, in such places as Thailand, Poland, Romania, and Lithuania, where high-value captives were interrogated, often brutally, and where now each of these and other governments are having to come to terms with what was done on their soil, sometimes by their own intelligence people or in cooperation with ours, or by our people on their soil. The consequence of these official actions and statements is that many lower-level troops said they believed that the gloves were off regarding treatment of prisoners. By the end of 2002 at Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, interrogators began routinely depriving detainees of sleep by means of shackling them to the ceiling. Secretary of Defense Donna Rumsfeld later approved interrogation techniques in writing for Guantanamo that included extended sleep deprivation, so-called stress positions, extended nudity in all temperatures, sensory deprivation, as in like masks and things over the face and eyes, and threatened detainees with dogs. Many of the same techniques were later used in Iraq. Often these were used in combination, so you'd get sleep deprivation, maybe the loud music at all hours, stress positions, shackling, nudity, also sexual humiliation occurred, sensory deprivation, and the dogs. And there were some other things too, and in some cases including like being put in coffin-like boxes, and there were some other things as well. Often these were used in combination. Much of the torture that occurred in Guantanamo, Afghanistan, and Iraq was never explicitly authorized, but the authorization of the CIA's techniques explicitly depended on setting aside the traditional legal rules that protected captives. The architects of the detention and interrogation regimes sought and were given crucial support from people in the medical and legal fields. This implicates profound ethical questions for those two professions, medicine and law, and the report attempts to address those issues. I think it's the most extensive treatment of the compromise of medical and legal ethics in the period after 9/11. And as an ethicist who has done some professional ethics, I found this a very important dimension of our discovery. On the medical side, policymakers eagerly accepted a proposal presented by a small group of behavioral psychologists to use the Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape program, the SEER program, to fashion a harsh interrogation regime for people captured in the new war on terror. The use of the SEER program was a signal example of flawed decision-making at many levels with serious consequences. The SEER program was originally developed to deal with the situation of downed U.S. airmen providing false statements or confessions to their captors in the Korean War after they were tortured. Those who promoted it as a form of interrogation for people in the War on Terror had no experience in interrogation at all. This involved bypassing the existing specialists in interrogation in many branches of our government, including one of whom, one of these folks was on our panel and was able to talk about that. In other words, people who had experience in successful interrogations in the FBI and in the military were bypassed, and therefore we actually lost the ability to extract truthful and usable information from captives within the rule of law. Meanwhile, lawyers in the Justice Department provided legal guidance in the aftermath of the attacks that seemed to go to great lengths to allow treatment that amounted to torture. To deal with the regime of laws and treaties designed to prohibit and prevent torture, here's exactly how our report puts it. The lawyers provided novel, if not acrobatic, interpretations to allow the mistreatment of prisoners. Those early memoranda, which defined torture narrowly, would engender widespread and withering criticism once they became public. The successors of those government lawyers in the Office of Legal Counsel of the Justice Department eventually moved to overturn those earlier legal memoranda. Even though the initial memoranda were disowned, the memorable language that leaked out and that therefore told the world that for a while the U.S. defined torture as only acts that might implicate organ failure remain a stain on the image of the United States and are a potential aid to repressive regimes elsewhere when they seek approval or justification of their own acts. What the early opinions from lawyers and the advice from psychologists about how to manipulate detainees during interrogation shared in common was that they both seemed to be aimed primarily at giving the client, the administration, what they wanted to hear. And undoubtedly, a lot of these folks were under extraordinary pressure. Information or arguments that contravened the advice that were wanted were ignored, minimized, or suppressed. Our recommendations address ways to prevent this kind of systemic problem from occurring in the future. The detention policies of the Bush administration we now can see can be divided into two different periods. The more aggressive approach in the early years of 2002 to 2005 changed, notably after it sunk in what had happened at Abu Ghraib. The condemnation that came ferociously after the release of the Abu Ghraib photos was accompanied by feelings of shame among many Americans. It is difficult to overstate the effect of the Abu Ghraib disclosures on the direction of U.S. policies on detainee treatment. They did change gradually after that. We discovered that there may have been another opportunity to bring about a shift in momentum that was lost. This is new reporting from our staff. There was an internal debate at the highest levels of the International Committee of the Red Cross as to how aggressive to be with U.S. policymakers. The Red Cross, by tradition, does not speak publicly about what its staff learn about detention situations. But some officials were so offended by their discoveries at Guantanamo, they argued that the group had to be more forceful in confronting the Defense Department. In the end, the top leadership of the Red Cross decided against confrontation, and a valuable opportunity may have been missed. Eventually, when that report was leaked to the New York Times, it was quite a powerful part of the unraveling of the policies. Another observation is that President Obama came to quickly discover that his promised sweeping reform of the detention regime could not be easily implemented. A major reason for this was that Congress resisted. The opposition to President Obama's plans was sometimes bipartisan, notably to those proposals to close Guantanamo and bring some of the detainees onto U.S. soil for trial. Many believe that Mr. Obama and his aides did not move swiftly enough, thus allowing opposition to build in Congress and contributing to a situation in which we still have about 165 people on Guantanamo, half of whom have already been cleared for release, but can't or won't be released anywhere. The other 80 or so are in a legal limbo. The evidence about them is too tainted for them to be put on trial. They can't be tried on U.S. soil, and all of this. So there's an extensive discussion in our report about ways to finally close Guantanamo. So today, the U.S. is still detaining people that it regards as dangerous. The treatment of these detainees has been transformed in some positive ways, even before our report. The U.S. military has vastly improved its procedures for screening captives It no longer engages in large-scale coercive interrogation techniques. The regime of capture and detention has, in recent years, been overtaken by technology and supplanted in large measure by the use of drones to kill suspected terrorists rather than capture them. Drones raise other issues, of course, which I am not talking about today, though I'm happy to answer a question if you want. So some concluding comments to kind of step back a little bit. My role on this panel primarily consisted of keeping the moral questions alive in our deliberations and helping the panel avoid succumbing to mere utilitarianism. To ask, does torture work, is not a question that can exhaust public reflection on detainee policy. In fact, it is a terribly misleading question, even in legal terms, because our legal obligations include an absolute ban on torture. It'd be like asking whether torture works in disciplining a child. Does torture work? Well, maybe better than, just a nice talking to. But no, we don't torture children, and we don't torture anybody. Torture is a rare example of a practice that in international law is absolutely banned. No exceptions. So the fact that we have been seduced into having a conversation about whether it might be okay sometimes represents a terrible moral deterioration in our country. Terrible. And we used to lead the way in arguing for an absolute legal ban on torture. So the fact that we have polls, should we or should we not torture? Does it work? Is not only disastrous for our own soul as a country, but has also sapped our leadership role around the world and helped to make it more legitimate for dictators and tyrants the world over to torture people in their custody. America, the exceptional nation, is not being very exceptional here. Everyone that I encountered on the panel, the detainee task force, was operating with a moral compass that mattered deeply to them. I admire the way that these panel members, I didn't know about their faith backgrounds, but all of them were able to combine love of country with a higher love of the good and the right. Another way to say it is that they did not absolutize national security, as if concern for protecting America justifies just anything and everything that one might conceivably undertake toward that end. Some of the most morally outraged people by the findings that we discovered were the military people themselves on our panel. Because what was happening was the compromise of military traditions that these men and women held dear. 3-star generals. I take people like that seriously. For me, concern about detainee abuse and torture was motivated by deeply held Christian convictions related to the sacred worth of each and every human being without exception. The human being, in one sense, is where divinity and humanity meet. And that is true whether you're a suspected terrorist or whether you're not. My work on the torture issue over many years deeply informs my new book, The Sacredness of Human Life. It deepens my sense of the absolute necessity of this ethical framework to help us transcend the passions of the moment. Passions of the moment. Those people are terrible. They deserve no respect. We should make them pay for what they did to us. That is precisely why we have morality, why we have legal codes to prevent us from doing what we feel like doing when we are most angry and most afraid. I was glad to discover on the panel patriotic, morally thoughtful government leaders of the caliber that were there. I was gladdened by their willingness to follow the truth where it led, regardless of prior views or any kind of party loyalty or ideological affiliation. It is conceivable that somebody like an Asa Hutchinson will not be elected governor of Arkansas because somebody from his right will attack him for being involved on this panel. He will pay a price, possibly. I respect somebody like that a lot. The report makes me proud to be an American. I am also proud to have been able to bear a quiet Christian witness through my involvement in this task force. I think there's a final lesson to be learned about the role of activists, Christian or otherwise. Most of what anti-torture activists reported, and also what reporters, as in investigative reporters, discovered as early as 2002, has now been borne out by our report. So for the activist community, when the headline is U.S. front page, New York Times on Tuesday, U.S. tortured detainees. It's like, duh, well, we knew that. But there's something here about the role of activists. This is not the first time that a committed minority, doggedly pursuing an issue based on moral convictions or just the desire to know the truth, has been proven right in its concerns. Even if at the time that they were doing their work, they were derided as foolish or misguided. This happened to me when I first started writing about this issue in 2005. Hate on me haters. I mean, there was plenty of that came my way. Plenty of hatred, including from people who were once my friends. We need dogged activists, researchers, investigative reporters, and people who shine the light of truth into the darkest corners of any society and tell what they discover there. Maybe 10 years later, everybody else will catch up. The world, our nation, and the church always needs its cadres of morally serious activists who keep moral issues before the conscience of communities that very much would prefer not to address them. We need to continue to produce and nurture such prophetic voices. I hope that congregations like this one, with their commitment to activism rooted in faith, will produce those who have the vocation to be our investigators and gadflies and reporters and truth-tellers in the future. So that the next time we lose our way, there'll be somebody from this congregation who will see it and will name it and will help to prevent that kind of thing from continuing. So I urge you to read the report. It is comprehensive. It involves all kinds of new investigative reporting, and official Washington, though rather distracted last week, understands that something important has been done in this report, and it is for everyone to read who cares about the United States and our future. Thank you very much.
I'm going to ask you the first two questions. Thank you, David. We have microphones that are coming to you. Please raise your hand and we'll get them to you. I want to pose the first two questions. There's a hand right back there, Virginia. Right back there. But the first two questions. So, David, can you talk about the state of torture now? The state of U.S.-supported torture since the Bush administration. And then comment on the action that's needed. We were not blind to what was going on with the Bush administration here at All Saints and spoke out against it and wrote about it and wrote the president. And we, I think, along with a lot of America, felt that kind of stonewall response that we got from the Bush White House. So if you could speak to that context of the politics of that day, but more to the point, the context of the receptivity of Washington to this kind of activism now. So the state of torture and then the state of activism.
When Barack Obama was running for president, he said that he would shut down the interrogation program as he found it, even though it had already been improved. And that appears to be the case. We do not find any evidence that the United States is torturing anybody now. Though we did point to Appendix M in the revised Army Field Manual, which we made a recommendation that there are some things that were put in there that we still think cross the line if they should ever be deployed. And so we're arguing for a change in one piece of the current Army Field Manual, but it's still relatively small scale compared to what we were dealing with before. There is the issue of the U.S.'s relationship with allies that don't have the human rights standards that we're talking about. There has been considerable attention to what happens in Afghanistan with our supposed ally army there in Afghanistan, including at Bagram Air Base. And one issue is turning over our detention center to the Afghans, which I think we did recently, if I'm remembering, may be tantamount to consigning the people there to torture because that army has a repeated record of abuses. One of the things that was very disturbing that we discovered is what happened even beginning in the Clinton years was something like sending detainees of foreign nationals to their home countries on the basis of assurances that they'll be treated properly, like Libya, for example, and where people were tortured, and we could know that they were tortured. It's one of those, please don't tell us what happened, just give us some information. So we talk about the rendition program, and we still have concerns related to how we relate to governments that we know torture. Okay. So far, I have not seen a single response from anybody whose policies were implicated by this report. I mean, it was only Tuesday, but so far the reaction appears to be not fierce denunciations, but silence. I think that this report may have gotten the attention, the seriousness of the report may have gotten the attention of the people who are named in the report, but let's just say this, though we are not prosecutors, the report does not recommend prosecution, but it does say that under U.S. treaty obligations, if we know that Americans have practiced torture, well, both under our law and under our treaty obligations, we are obligated to prosecute. And that hasn't happened. And so there's a lot of question as to whether everybody in government's hands are so dirty with this matter or desiring to stay out of it that we're not going to get any action on the part even of a Democratic administration. I think that's probably likely. And it may be 20 years before we actually get the kind of proper rule of law response to what we have found. So I actually think that our democracy has been gradually deteriorating in our rule of law under the impact of a kind of a national security idolatry that probably goes back to the Cold War. And so habits have been developing of kind of eroding the rule of law that I think accelerated here and that are not easily repaired, but we need to be paying attention to trying to repair them. Yeah.
First question, Norm?
David, could you speak to the suppressed congressional report? And have you had access to it? And could you compare and contrast your work with theirs?
Yes. There's a Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report, which we understand is 6,000 pages long. And they had subpoena power, and we didn't have it. So, and theirs is focused on the CIA only, is our understanding. And it is sitting there waiting to be released. And part of what we do in the report is to call for the release of the 6,000-page Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report. Senator Feinstein, I think, is the chair of that committee. And so it is appropriate for you Californians to let Senator Feinstein know you'd like to get that report released. And we call for that as well. So we lacked subpoena power, and the CIA is notoriously hard to get information from. And because it was the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, they saw documents that the world needs to see, at least that we Americans need to see. And so we are calling for the release of that report. Ours is a shorter report, focused more broadly, but it is time for the truth to be told. And so we called for the release of that report. By the way, even before now, there were a number of internal reports that most people don't know about. Defense Department reports, investigative committee reports, and we reviewed all of those. There's a long paper trail now, and most of the important documents, or many of them, have been leaked in one way or another along the way. And so it's possible to have really good information by now, but nothing as thorough as the Senate Select Committee report, which needs to be released.
I understand your point about the question of whether torture works or not. That from a moral point of view, it's irrelevant. And I liken it to the death penalty. The death penalty is something where we can save a lot of money. That has nothing to do with the moral issue of whether the death penalty is a good idea or not.
Right.
But on the other hand, there's a lot of folks in this country who are not where you are. And to the extent that there's analysis in that report about whether torture works, because I've heard a lot of evidence that it doesn't work, it seems to me to be very helpful in the same way that saying we can save a lot of money by not employing the death penalty helps the arguments about the death penalty. So if
Yes.
you could comment on what they did say in there, I'd be very interested. Thanks.
Let's get John's question, because that'll be the last question we
Okay.
can, and you can respond.
Sure.
to both.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I had this question. I think that many people believe that the people who committed torture and legal contortionism, as you describe it, believe they were acting in good faith.
Right.
And it may well be that they now think mistakes were made. I was there. I made them. And there are many people who believe that prosecution and imprisonment is not very appropriate under these circumstances.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, as an ethicist and a moralist and a religious leader, your thoughts about the reactions of the people who went through that experience and their recovery from it.
Yeah, that's a good question. On the issue of efficacy, we decided to devote a whole chapter of the report to efficacy. And it's called True and False Confessions. And the basic finding is that there's no reliable information that overall the program was efficacious, or that it was any more efficacious than a regular interrogation would have been. But and most of the people, there's this kind of game going on where people who have some of the intelligence say, there's things we can't tell you, but we know that it worked, but we can't tell you what that was. And so it's really hard to evaluate such claims. To your very thoughtful question, yes, I think that one of the things I said in panel deliberations was, for people who made those decisions, they are now professionally, and you might say historically and reputationally, committed to the decisions that they made at that time. And forever, when somebody writes about certain of these folks, that will be linked to their name. And when the evidence turns out to be against such a decision, when historians look back and say that was a mistake, if you're that person, you're, in a sense, your only option is repentance or standing firm. Those are your options. And if you're afraid of prosecution, you're more likely to at least publicly stand firm. And I think that's to be predicted. So I feel a certain, and I hear from you, a certain level of sympathy for people who are in this situation. There are questions. This is just like any other situation in which a government official violates the law, and the people in the government have to decide what is the best way to handle that. Is the best way simply to tell the truth? Is the best way to apologize? Is the best way to make reparations for those who've been hurt? Is the best way to prosecute? And different societies have made different decisions there. In a sense, I think that telling the truth is what we've begun the process of doing with this report. I do think that under our law, we owe reparations to people who were tortured. And that seems especially unobjectionable when you think about people who we tortured who were not, in fact, terrorists. We tortured lots of innocent people. Certainly they deserve reparations. And so do the others, I think. But in any case, I kind of doubt that anybody will ever be prosecuted at a high level for this. Or if they are prosecuted, I think they are likely to be pardoned. But that is a judgment call above my pay grade. But I would say that democracy and the rule of law are fragile things. And it is the role of citizens to guard these fragile institutions from corruption. And they were corrupted here. And the checks and balances system didn't work very well. And we need to do better in the future. And whatever decision is made about people from the past has to be in service of protecting the rule of law, human rights, and the best traditions of our nation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very